There are moments when heaven feels sealed, when prayer echoes back like sound in an empty room. You ask, you wait, and nothing moves. The silence grows heavier with each passing day, pressing against your chest until it becomes hard to breathe. You begin to wonder if you've been forgotten, if perhaps you've drifted too far. But what if this silence is not the end of communication, but the beginning of formation? What if what feels like distance is actually the sacred space where transformation begins? In psychology, silence is never just absence. It's the environment where the mind reorganizes, the moment when noise no longer dictates perception. The same happens with the soul. When God withdraws his voice, he's not vanishing. He's reconditioning your spiritual attention, shifting your awareness from dependency to discernment. Andrew Huberman once said that stillness rewires the brain's networks for attention and endurance. Spiritually, God's quiet does the same. It rebuilds your ability to stay grounded when certainty fades, to sense truth without needing constant affirmation. Every story of growth begins with a pause. The seed buried in the dark must face silence before life breaks through. The cocoon must endure confinement before flight becomes possible. Divine silence isn't punishment, it's preparation. It's the moment between destruction and design where the invisible hand of God does its most intricate work. It's here in the unseen that your identity is being reshaped. Many confuse noise for progress. We chase signs, answers, confirmations, forgetting that clarity rarely comes from movement, but from stillness. God's silence disrupts that addiction. It detaches you from the constant need to hear, to see, to feel, until faith becomes what it was always meant to be: trust without proof. This silence is not abandonment, it's recalibration. In the next few moments, you'll be invited to walk through the inner architecture of this quiet season. We'll explore what God is actually doing beneath the surface when he stops speaking. You'll discover that silence has texture, that it teaches, purifies, and heals in ways words never could. And as each part unfolds, you'll begin to understand that what you thought was divine distance was in fact divine depth. So take a breath. Let the world around you fall still, because before revelation comes formation, and formation always begins in the quiet. The silence that breaks the noise. We live in an age that worships noise. Every second is filled with movement, sound, reaction, validation. The moment silence enters, panic follows. We scroll, speak, distract, and fill every gap because quiet feels unnatural. But God's silence isn't the same as absence. It's interruption. It's his way of breaking through the false rhythms that have trained us to mistake activity for alignment. When he goes silent, he's not ignoring you. He's disrupting the pattern that keeps you from truly hearing him. That first moment of silence feels like chaos because we've built our sense of identity on constant input. The notifications of life, praise, approval, information, noise, feed the illusion that motion equals meaning. But silence dismantles that illusion. It takes away the comfort of external signals and exposes the internal void we've been avoiding. It's in that void that God begins his deepest work. Psychologically, the human brain has been conditioned to associate silence with threat. In studies on sensory deprivation, subjects report heightened anxiety and a distorted sense of time after just a few minutes in complete quiet. Our nervous system interprets stillness as danger because we've evolved to respond to constant feedback. Yet in the realm of faith, what feels like danger to the body often signals transformation to the soul. God uses silence to detox your nervous system from spiritual overstimulation. The same way your brain resets when you stop flooding it with noise, your spirit resets when God stops responding in ways you can measure. It's a neurological and spiritual fast, a purification of perception. In this quiet, the mind protests. It searches for evidence, for signs, for sound. You begin to question if you've done something wrong. But silence is not divine punishment. It's divine prioritization. God removes external confirmation to strengthen internal conviction. Without realizing it, you've depended on noise to affirm your direction. But real growth begins when affirmation fades. That's when faith stops being a reaction and becomes an anchor. The silence is not random, it's a mirror. It reflects your hidden dependencies, the patterns you couldn't see when life was loud. Silence shows you how much of your peace depended on the world being predictable. It exposes whether your faith is built on emotional comfort or spiritual resilience. Modern neuroscience supports this hidden wisdom. When the brain is deprived of constant stimulation, it activates the default mode network, the region responsible for reflection, memory, and self-awareness. That's why God speaks in stillness. Silence forces the mind to turn inward, where the real conversation begins. It's in this space that the fragmented parts of you start aligning. The noise that once filled your consciousness was only masking your disconnection. Now stripped of sound, your awareness expands. What once felt like emptiness becomes sacred territory. You begin to hear not with your ears, but with your spirit. The absence of God's voice becomes the instrument that tunes you back to His frequency. When God breaks the noise, everything you built on distraction collapses. It's uncomfortable, but necessary. The silence tears down illusions of control, forcing you to listen not for answers, but for alignment. This is the turning point where external chaos becomes internal order. You start to realize that peace isn't found in what happens around you, but in the stillness that takes root within you. The silence that once felt unbearable now feels magnetic. It's no longer something you endure, it's something you need. Because within that silence, God is not withholding Himself. He's revealing Himself differently. He's teaching you to discern His presence in stillness, to trust the unseen, to recognize that divine movement doesn't always make a sound. So when everything goes quiet, don't rush to fill it. The silence is not empty, it's sacred. It's the pause between breaths, the gap between your last understanding and your next revelation. When the noise breaks, truth begins to echo. And that echo is not absence, it's formation. God is not silent because He has nothing to say. He's silent because He's doing what words can't describe. He's rebuilding your perception, rewiring your awareness, and preparing your spirit to move with depth instead of noise. The world shouts, but God whispers, and if you want to hear Him, you must first let the noise break. The sacred disorientation. When God goes silent, the first thing that collapses is your sense of direction. You pray, you wait, you listen, and nothing answers back. The coordinates that once guided you disappear, and what used to feel like divine certainty now feels like drifting in fog. This is the sacred disorientation, the holy unraveling of your need to understand before you trust. The human mind resists this process because it's wired for predictability. It wants patterns, clarity, and cause and effect. Yet spiritual growth lives in the opposite realm, where logic fades and faith must learn to see in the dark. In that silence, every familiar point of reference dissolves. Your prayers echo into vastness, your emotions lose balance, and the map you once followed burns in your hands. But what if the disorientation is not destruction? What if it's the necessary confusion that precedes divine clarity? In cognitive psychology, disorientation occurs when the brain is forced to abandon a familiar framework without yet having a new one. It's a liminal space, uncomfortable, uncertain, but necessary for reorganization. The same happens to the soul when God interrupts the patterns you've relied on. The silence isn't a void, it's a recalibration. God strips away what your mind clings to so that your faith can stop depending on evidence and start depending on essence. What feels like loss is the dismantling of false certainty. You are being freed from the illusion that control equals safety. Spiritual maturity demands that you let go of what no longer fits your evolution. God's silence is the scalpel that cuts the old attachments away. It's in this stage that doubt screams the loudest. You begin to question your prayers, your worth, even your relationship with God. The ego fights to regain control, whispering that something must be wrong. But the truth is more profound. Silence is not God's rejection, it's His trust. He trusts you enough to let you walk without the training wheels of constant reassurance. This sacred disorientation is the divine invitation to build faith that no longer depends on sensory proof. It's where emotion yields to conviction, where spiritual muscles form through resistance. The absence you feel is not neglect, it's the space where endurance grows. Biologically, your body reacts to this disorientation with discomfort. When the nervous system senses uncertainty, it releases stress hormones preparing for threat. Yet if you stay in that discomfort long enough, something shifts. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new pathways, awakens. As you adapt to the silence, your perception expands. You begin to sense subtler layers of awareness, learning to recognize presence in absence, movement in stillness, meaning in delay. It's the same process the brain uses when mastering any new skill: disorientation first, integration later. Spiritually, the same truth applies. God's silence is the neural stretch of your faith. During this stage, it's tempting to grasp for control. You'll want to create your own noise, force clarity, or numb the waiting. But if you can resist that urge, something sacred happens. You begin to see that faith isn't a feeling, it's a position. It's choosing to stay grounded when nothing makes sense. That choice rewires your emotional response, replacing panic with patience, fear with surrender. The silence becomes a teacher, and the disorientation becomes a map, one drawn not on paper, but on the walls of your own transformation. You start realizing that confusion isn't the opposite of clarity, it's the birthplace of it. When God removes the familiar, He's not leaving you lost. He's guiding you into deeper orientation, one not dependent on the surface of things. What feels like drifting is actually divine navigation. He's training your intuition to trust what your intellect can't yet comprehend. This is the hidden intelligence of the silence. It deconstructs your logic to reconstruct your spirit. The sacred disorientation forces you to stop leaning on understanding and start resting in trust. And once you accept that, you stop begging for the noise to return. You begin to notice a new rhythm underneath the stillness, a pulse of divine timing, beating quietly but steadily. The silence hasn't changed. You have. You no longer fear it because you've learned that losing your way in God's silence is how you finally find Him. The hidden classroom of stillness. When everything around you slows down and heaven seems to stop responding, you enter what feels like a waiting room for the soul. Nothing moves. No new doors open. The noise that once surrounded your life fades, leaving only stillness that feels almost unbearable. Yet this is not an empty space. It's a hidden classroom. In this silence, God begins teaching lessons that can only be learned when movement ceases. Every delay becomes a lecture in patience. Every unanswered prayer becomes a study in trust. And every quiet moment becomes a mirror, showing you who you are when nothing external defines you. Stillness is not the absence of progress. It is the environment where real progress begins. The mind, conditioned by constant motion, resists this stage. It equates stillness with stagnation. But neuroscience tells another story. When the body rests, the brain doesn't stop. It reorganizes. During deep stillness, the brain's internal networks, the same ones that process learning, emotion, and meaning, ignite with activity. This is when connections are strengthened, clarity is born, and new understanding emerges. Spiritually, the same mechanism unfolds. When God silences the world around you, He's reconfiguring your spiritual networks. The stillness becomes a construction site for unseen transformation. What looks like nothing happening is actually everything happening at once, beneath the surface of awareness. Stillness is not passive, it's profoundly active. It's where God begins detoxing your inner life from the addiction to urgency. You start noticing how restless your thoughts have been, how dependent your peace was on speed and stimulation. In this quiet classroom, God retrains your nervous system to live from rhythm instead of reaction. The absence of noise becomes therapy for the soul, lowering the volume of anxiety until you begin hearing the subtle frequencies of divine truth. This is what Andrew Huberman describes as neural adaptation, the shift where your brain stops chasing novelty and starts finding value in presence. It's in this rewiring that your faith begins to mature, no longer dependent on visible movement to feel alive. At first, stillness feels like exile. You look around and see no signs of life. But in time, you begin to sense that this space is not punishment, it's preparation. You realize that God hasn't stopped speaking. He's changed His teaching method. Instead of instructing through words, He's instructing through quiet discipline. He's training your spirit to observe without reacting, to listen without demanding, to breathe without rushing. The silence reveals your inner architecture, your fears, your compulsions, your attachments. Each one becomes a subject of study in this divine classroom. God allows discomfort to surface so that awareness can take root. He dismantles your old responses not to weaken you, but to teach you mastery over your emotional landscape. As days pass in this sacred stillness, a subtle shift occurs. The anxiety that once filled the silence begins to lose its grip. You start hearing nuances in the quiet, the soft rhythm of your own breath, the internal dialogue of faith replacing fear. The stillness becomes familiar, even comforting. You discover that peace was never a reward for movement, but a result of alignment. In this state, God's presence feels less like a voice and more like atmosphere, constant, gentle, surrounding everything. You begin learning through awareness rather than information. The classroom is not external anymore, it's within you. Every lesson here is silent but unforgettable. Stillness teaches you to recognize that your value was never tied to your productivity. It teaches that answers delayed are not answers denied. It teaches that divine timing cannot be rushed, only received. Most of all, it teaches that hearing God is not always about listening for sound. It's about becoming still enough to recognize His shaping hand in the quiet. When you finally surrender to the stillness, you realize it was never about waiting for Him to move. It was about learning to move differently yourself. God's silence becomes your education, His quiet becomes your teacher, and your stillness becomes the classroom where faith graduates into wisdom. The deconstruction of the old self. There comes a moment in the silence when the lesson shifts. You're no longer learning how to wait or how to listen. You're learning how to let go of who you used to be. This is the most confronting part of divine quiet, the moment when God stops speaking, not to test your faith, but to dismantle your false identities. Every layer that was built on approval, performance, and fear begins to crumble. You start realizing that much of what you called faith was really dependency on feeling, that much of your confidence was built on being seen, and that much of your peace was borrowed from circumstances. In this silence, God becomes a sculptor. Each moment of stillness is a strike of His chisel, removing what no longer resembles His design. You are being deconstructed, not destroyed. He's undoing the version of you that survived through noise so that a truer self can emerge through stillness. Psychologically, this stage mirrors what cognitive therapy calls schema disruption. Schemas are the mental frameworks that define how we interpret life. They shape our identity, our worth, our sense of control. When God enters the silence, He begins exposing how many of those frameworks were built around self-protection rather than purpose. You start to see that the person you've been clinging to was never your authentic self. It was your adaptation to pain, your mask for survival. The silence forces confrontation with this truth. There are no distractions left to keep your illusions alive. The more you fight to hold the old self together, the more it fractures. It's not punishment, it's purification. You are being freed from the architecture of the past. The breaking feels personal. It touches every area you thought was stable, your relationships, your goals, even your self-image. You wonder why everything that once gave you confidence now feels fragile. Yet beneath that discomfort, something sacred is happening. The silence reveals what's real. When external validation is stripped away, you learn whether your faith is rooted in applause or authenticity. God removes the noise because noise maintains illusions. When silence enters, truth surfaces. You begin to see how often you've mistaken motion for meaning, how often your worth depended on being productive or needed. Now, stripped of those roles, you face yourself in raw form. And though it feels like loss, it's actually liberation. In neuroscience, transformation begins with pruning. The brain eliminates old neural connections to make room for stronger, more efficient ones. Spiritually, God performs the same process. In this quiet dismantling, He prunes away habits, beliefs, and emotional attachments that no longer serve your evolution. He's rewiring your identity, forming a more stable structure that can carry the weight of purpose. This process hurts because the ego experiences it as death, but in truth it's rebirth. The old self cannot enter the new season. The silence becomes a womb, a sacred dark space where the old dissolves and the new begins to form, unseen but undeniable. Every layer removed in this process exposes another truth. You start noticing how much of your energy was spent trying to control outcomes. You see how often your prayers were rooted in fear of losing what was never meant to stay. You begin to understand that God's silence was never distance, it was surgery. He was cutting through the noise of your self-perception to reveal the quiet strength beneath. As you surrender to this deconstruction, a strange peace begins to replace the fear. You no longer need everything to make sense, because you can feel the purpose inside the process. The silence becomes less like a void and more like a threshold. You start to sense that who you're becoming is lighter, freer, closer to truth. By the time this stage ends, you no longer recognize the person who entered it. The one who needed answers has become someone who can rest without them. The one who sought validation has learned to live from alignment. The one who feared silence now calls it home. This is the mystery of God's quiet. It doesn't just change your circumstances, it changes your identity. When the noise stops, you finally hear your own soul speak, and you realize that God was never trying to take something from you. He was trying to give you back yourself. The gravity of unanswered prayers. There is a weight that settles over the heart when prayers go unanswered. It's the ache of silence that lingers after you've said all the right words, done all the right things, and waited longer than you ever thought you could. You look toward heaven expecting movement, but nothing shifts. Time keeps passing, and faith begins to feel like standing in place while the world moves on without you. Yet what if the silence that follows your prayer isn't rejection, but refinement? What if unanswered prayers carry a gravity meant to pull your soul into deeper alignment with the very thing you're asking for? God's silence is not emptiness, it's precision. Every delay, every quiet moment is a divine calibration, positioning you to receive what you are becoming, not just what you've requested. Psychologically, waiting creates cognitive dissonance, the tension between expectation and reality. The brain craves closure, so when outcomes don't arrive, it interprets uncertainty as danger. That's why unanswered prayers feel so heavy. Your nervous system reacts as though something is breaking, when in truth, something is being built. Andrew Huberman explains that the mind rewires itself through friction. The space between desire and fulfillment is where neuroplasticity thrives. Spiritually, the same principle applies. Unanswered prayers create spiritual elasticity, stretching your faith beyond comfort so that when the answer does arrive, you have the capacity to hold it. The waiting is not wasted. It's weight training for the soul. Every prayer you've ever spoken carries energy, hope, fear, longing. When heaven holds it in silence, that energy doesn't vanish. It transforms. God doesn't ignore your petitions. He reorders them. Sometimes you're asking for relief, but He's preparing resilience. Sometimes you're begging for a door, but He's building the foundation of the house. The delay is not denial, it's distinction. God waits until what you desire will no longer destroy you. And that timing often feels unbearable because we measure it by our impatience, while He measures it by transformation. The unanswered prayer becomes a gravitational field, drawing every fragmented part of your faith into alignment. The longer you stay in orbit around that silence, the more your character stabilizes. Eventually, your need for outcomes evolves into trust in orchestration. This silence is holy because it exposes your relationship with control. You begin to see how much of your faith was transactional, how often you believed in God as long as He performed according to your timeline. When the answers stop coming, that illusion collapses, and though it hurts, it's here that genuine faith is born. True faith doesn't depend on response, it depends on relationship. The unanswered prayer becomes a mirror that asks, do you love me only when I say yes? Or do you trust me even when my silence speaks no? This question transforms prayer from request into communion. It teaches you to seek presence over outcome, formation over fulfillment. From a psychological lens, this transformation mirrors what behavioral scientists call delayed gratification. The prefrontal cortex, the brain's seat of discipline and long-term vision, activates when you resist impulsive satisfaction. Spiritually, waiting in silence strengthens the same region of your inner life. It gives you vision beyond emotion. The longer you endure the delay, the more you train your spiritual attention to stay grounded in peace rather than results. You begin to embody resilience instead of merely praying for it. The unanswered prayer becomes less about what you're asking for and more about who you're becoming while you wait. Then comes a quiet revelation. Somewhere in the waiting, the weight shifts. The unanswered prayer no longer feels like punishment. It feels like protection. You start to see threads connecting moments that once seemed random. What you thought was divine delay was divine choreography. God was aligning timing, people, and purpose to meet you in a future moment that only now makes sense. You realize that had your prayer been answered earlier, it would have satisfied the old version of you, the one still driven by fear, still addicted to control. But now, through the silence, you've changed. The answer you once demanded no longer holds the same power. You've grown into someone who no longer needs the noise of fulfillment to recognize the sound of grace. In this realization, you discover the paradox of unanswered prayers. They are not empty spaces, but sacred gravitational wells where faith becomes substance. The silence was never meant to break you. It was meant to deepen you, to draw you into a state where you no longer chase outcomes, because you've learned to rest in orchestration. You stop demanding signs and start living as one. That's when the gravity lifts. Not because the prayer has been answered, but because you've become the answer. The mirror in the desert. When God leads you into silence, the world around you doesn't stop, but something within you does. The pace that once drove your life slows to an almost unbearable stillness. You wake up and feel the same routine pressing against your days, yet inside something feels foreign. It's as if every echo of life has grown distant, and you've been placed in a spiritual desert, a vast, dry place where even your prayers seem to evaporate before they reach heaven. At first, you think you've been abandoned. But as the days stretch and the quiet deepens, you start to realize that the desert is not exile. It's exposure. It's not where God hides from you. It's where He holds up a mirror. And in that mirror, you no longer see who you pretend to be. You see who you truly are. The desert strips away everything that once defined you. The titles, the routines, the noise that used to drown out your thoughts, all of it fades until only raw humanity remains. This is where your inner world becomes audible. The quiet amplifies what the noise concealed: your fears, insecurities, hidden motives, and forgotten wounds. It's unsettling at first, because silence magnifies the parts of you that you've spent years avoiding. But that's the purpose of the desert. It's the environment of truth where God removes the distractions that kept you from facing yourself. You begin to see that the loneliness you blame on His absence is often the space He created for self-revelation. Psychologically, this process mirrors what behavioral scientists call exposure therapy, the gradual confrontation of what the mind fears most until it loses its power. The desert functions in the same way. It exposes your dependence on control, your attachment to certainty, your avoidance of pain. God allows this exposure not to shame you, but to heal you. The mind, when stripped of distractions, defaults to introspection. The silence forces awareness to turn inward, revealing the emotional structures that have been quietly shaping your reactions and choices. This is why the desert feels harsh. It's not the lack of comfort that hurts, it's the abundance of truth. The mirror of the desert reflects your contradictions with painful clarity. You see how you've prayed for peace while holding on to anxiety, how you've asked for purpose while avoiding change, how you've begged for closeness to God while resisting the solitude where He speaks most clearly. Every reflection is a revelation. And though it stings, it also awakens compassion for yourself and for others. You begin to understand that much of your striving was born from wounds, not wickedness. That your impatience came from pain, not pride. The desert becomes sacred therapy, where silence and grace work together to untangle the knots in your soul. Neuroscience tells us that when the brain experiences isolation, it activates the same neural pathways associated with physical pain. Loneliness literally hurts. But if you stay in that state long enough, the brain adapts. it begins to produce new chemical balances, re-establishing calm and introspection. Spiritually, this adaptation mirrors transformation. The longer you remain in the desert without running, the more you begin to find beauty in the stillness. You start hearing faint whispers, the wind moving through dry air, the pulse of your own breath, the almost imperceptible sense that God has been near all along. The silence doesn't change, but your perception does. What once felt like emptiness begins to feel like presence. The desert teaches discernment in ways comfort never could. It forces you to separate what is truly divine from what is merely emotional. It refines your spiritual hearing, allowing you to distinguish God's whisper from the echo of your own fear. You learn that revelation rarely shouts, it hums. And in that subtle vibration of awareness, you begin to sense His nearness again, not as a sound or a sign, but as stillness itself. You realize that the mirror in the desert was never meant to show you what was wrong with you, but what was real about you. Every fracture, every scar, every piece you once despised becomes visible in divine light, and you see that even your brokenness reflects Him. By the time the desert finishes its work, you don't emerge as someone who has conquered silence. You emerge as someone who no longer fears it. You walk out with clearer eyes, a steadier heart, and a faith no longer based on what God gives, but on who He is. The mirror in the desert teaches the greatest truth of all. God never abandoned you to the wilderness. He brought you there so that in the emptiness, you could finally see Him living within you. The silence was not absence, it was reflection, your reflection, gently revealing the divine image you had forgotten to recognize, the divine withdrawal. There comes a moment in every believer's life when God steps back. It's not a disappearance, not a punishment, but a divine withdrawal, a holy distance that feels almost unbearable at first. You reach out in prayer and feel nothing. You search the scriptures and the words seem lifeless. The presence that once wrapped around you like warmth now feels thin, almost absent. You wonder if you've done something wrong, if perhaps your faith has weakened or your devotion slipped. But what's happening in that silence is something far deeper. God withdraws not because He has abandoned you, but because He's awakening something in you. His absence is the training ground for spiritual authority. The silence isn't a rejection of your closeness, it's the call to maturity. The mind panics when what was once familiar disappears. From a neurological perspective, your brain is wired to seek consistency. Predictability equals safety. When that consistency vanishes, stress hormones rise and confusion sets in. Spiritually, this withdrawal has the same effect. It destabilizes your sense of control so that faith can learn to stand without support. God removes the emotional certainty of His presence to teach you that faith must move by alignment, not by sensation. The same way a parent steps back so a child can walk unaided, God steps back so your spirit can begin to operate from internal strength instead of external comfort. His silence is the invisible hand that forces you to balance on what you've already learned. This withdrawal also exposes dependency disguised as devotion. When His presence is constant, it's easy to confuse emotional closeness with spiritual depth. But when He steps back, you're left to see whether your worship was built on experience or endurance. Many pray for strength, yet strength only develops under resistance. God's distance becomes that resistance. It forces your spirit to activate muscles you didn't know you had, the ability to trust without reassurance, to believe without emotion, to love without reward. This is where faith graduates from belief to embodiment. It's no longer about feeling His nearness, but becoming His reflection in His perceived absence. From a psychological angle, this stage aligns with the concept of differentiation, the process by which a person becomes emotionally autonomous while maintaining connection. It's a sign of maturity. Spiritually, divine withdrawal works the same way. God differentiates you from dependency, teaching you to carry His nature even when you can't sense His nearness. You begin to realize that He's not trying to distance Himself. He's trying to inhabit you more completely. The silence becomes sacred space where you learn that His voice isn't gone. It's now woven into your conscience, your peace, your wisdom. You no longer chase His presence because you've become a vessel of it. At first, this realization feels subtle, almost imperceptible. You'll find moments of stillness when an unexpected calm settles over you. It's not the ecstatic feeling of spiritual highs, but a deep, grounded steadiness. That's the sign that the divine withdrawal has done its work. You're no longer reactive, no longer tossed between emotion and faith. You've begun to embody the quiet confidence that comes from knowing He is within you, not just around you. The external silence has awakened an internal voice, the whisper of discernment that doesn't shout, but guides like light through fog. You start recognizing that His withdrawal was never abandonment but initiation, an anointing that forms strength through separation. As time passes, what once felt like emptiness now feels like empowerment. You begin to thank Him for the silence because it taught you how to stand. You realize that the distance was never punishment, it was design. God was forming within you a faith that doesn't depend on constant contact, a maturity that doesn't crumble under uncertainty. You learn to move like He does, quietly, intentionally, unseen yet unshakable. Divine withdrawal transforms you into a reflection of His stability. The silence that once terrified you now becomes the language of trust. You no longer beg for His presence because you've learned the secret. He never left. He simply stepped back so that when you took your first steps into faith's maturity, you'd realize He was walking in you all along. The architecture of invisible work. There are seasons when everything appears still, where progress halts and heaven seems unmoved by your prayers. The plans you built stand untouched. The dreams you once held feel suspended mid-air. You look around and see no visible sign of movement, and that absence begins to weigh on you. But what if this stillness isn't stagnation? What if it's construction? What if beneath the surface of what you can't see, God is building something too precise, too intricate, and too foundational to be rushed? The architecture of invisible work is His most sacred craft. It's where He designs in silence, builds in shadows, and forms in hidden layers of your being what will one day support the visible life you've prayed for. Human nature equates visibility with value. If something isn't producing measurable results, we assume it's failing. But creation itself began in darkness. Long before light appeared, form existed in unseen waters. The same pattern unfolds in your life. God does His deepest work under the surface, away from recognition, away from noise. Neuroscience reveals that transformation often happens silently in the brain. Synapses strengthen in rest. Neural pathways reshape during stillness. The unseen activity within the mind mirrors the spiritual truth. God's construction is quiet, yet constant. Every delay, every moment of apparent inactivity is the Creator adjusting the internal architecture of your soul to hold what He's preparing to reveal. It's difficult to trust this stage because it feels unproductive. You want evidence of change, a sign of motion, a spark of progress. But invisible work rarely feels like movement. It feels like stillness. And that's because God is working on the foundation, not the facade. He's not just answering prayers, He's aligning structures. Every unanswered question becomes a beam of strength. Every disappointment becomes a pillar of endurance. Every waiting season becomes the scaffolding for wisdom. What He's building in the silence is not a temporary shelter, it's a temple. He's fortifying you from within so that when His timing finally unfolds, what He gives will not collapse under the weight of premature exposure. In psychology, there's a term called latent learning, growth that occurs without visible performance, discovered only when the right conditions reveal it. Spiritually, the same is true. God's silence conceals instruction that your spirit absorbs without realizing it. The lessons you think you're not learning are forming in the background of your awareness, ready to manifest when faith meets opportunity. This is why patience is not passive. It's participation in God's invisible work. You are being trained through unseen progress, strengthened through quiet repetition. Every moment of stillness is adding definition to the structure He's forming within you. The hardest part is that invisible construction doesn't announce itself. It feels like God is doing nothing when, in reality, He's reinforcing everything. Your faith becomes the scaffolding He builds upon, your obedience the material, your surrender the blueprint. You start realizing that every silence is strategic, every pause intentional. The stillness is not a stop sign, it's a seal. It means God's hands are at work in dimensions you cannot yet comprehend. While you're fixated on outcomes, He's perfecting foundations. He's teaching you to value strength over speed, alignment over advancement. Because what's born in haste breaks easily, but what's built in silence lasts forever. As you begin to trust the architecture of invisible work, peace starts replacing anxiety. You no longer rush to see results. You rest in the assurance that the unseen is already unfolding. The lack of movement no longer feels like punishment, but partnership. You start sensing divine timing moving quietly beneath your days. You begin to understand that silence is not the absence of God's activity, it's the evidence of His precision. He is laying out a design that only stillness can support. The moment you stop striving to see it, you start living in alignment with it. And one day, when the walls of your life rise into visibility, you'll realize that every unseen hour, every unanswered prayer, every quiet night was part of the blueprint. God was building in silence what would one day speak louder than words. The moment the light learns to listen. There comes a moment, after the long silence and the invisible work, when something within you changes. Not outside, not in the world around you, but deep inside your perception. You stop begging for signs, you stop chasing confirmations, and you start listening differently. It's no longer the frantic listening of someone desperate for answers, but the still, grounded awareness of someone who has finally learned the rhythm of divine quiet. This is the moment when the light learns to listen. The noise of striving fades, and your spirit begins to attune to the subtle frequencies of God's presence that have always been there. What you once called silence now feels like language. What you once feared as distance now feels like depth. In this stage, awareness becomes your sanctuary. The light you sought outside, the breakthroughs, the blessings, the clarity, begins to awaken within you. The mind, once restless and analytical, begins to soften into stillness. Andrew Huberman often speaks about the difference between focus and awareness. The former narrows attention, while the latter expands perception. Spiritually, this is the same shift that happens when the soul learns to listen in the silence. You no longer focus on trying to interpret every delay or decode every unanswered prayer. Instead, your awareness expands, allowing you to sense the presence of God in everything, the breath, the quiet, the ordinary moments that once seemed empty. This is not the end of the silence. It's the transformation of how you experience it. When light learns to listen, vision no longer depends on sight. You begin perceiving meaning in what once felt meaningless. You realize that the stillness you fought against was teaching you to hear not through sound, but through surrender. It's in this awareness that intuition awakens, not the impulsive kind driven by emotion, but the calm, precise knowing that comes from alignment with divine rhythm. You start recognizing that the whisper of God is not separate from your own inner voice when it's purified by stillness. This revelation changes everything. You no longer seek to hear Him in thunder, you begin to recognize Him in the silence between heartbeats. Psychologically, this shift mirrors what researchers call meta-awareness, the ability to observe your own consciousness without being consumed by it. In silence, your thoughts slow down enough for awareness to separate from reaction. This is where transformation solidifies. You stop identifying with fear, frustration, or confusion because you now observe them instead of becoming them. In that observation, peace emerges. It's not emotional peace, it's structural peace, a calm that exists because your mind and spirit have become synchronized. You are no longer at war with the silence, you are working with it. You begin to understand that the absence of noise isn't emptiness, it's resonance. God is no longer speaking to you, He's speaking through you. This state of listening light brings a strange reversal. You once begged for direction. Now you find it rising naturally within you. You once sought miracles. Now you perceive them in the smallest details. You once waited for God to intervene. Now you realize He's been inhabiting every breath. The silence has trained you to hear with perception, not desperation. And because of that, your spiritual sensitivity deepens. You start moving through the world differently, slower, but with greater precision. Your reactions become responses. Your prayers become communion. You don't need to fill the air with words anymore, because your awareness itself has become prayer. This is the beauty of divine stillness. When the light learns to listen, your soul begins to see, not with physical eyes, but with inner clarity that recognizes divine orchestration in every delay, every detour, every quiet second. You realize that hearing God was never about sound, it was about alignment. His silence wasn't meant to be decoded, it was meant to be felt. Every moment of stillness was a lesson in perception, teaching you that his presence doesn't need to announce itself to be real. By the time you reach this point, your faith no longer trembles in uncertainty. It stands quietly, like light resting on water, knowing that revelation doesn't always thunder, it often whispers. When the light learns to listen, revelation stops being something you chase and becomes something you live. You move from asking, "God, where are you?" to whispering, "You were here all along." The silence has fulfilled its purpose. It has tuned you to a new frequency of awareness. And now, every breath carries his voice, every moment holds his presence, and every shadow glows with his light. The resurrection of the quiet soul. After the silence, after the long unraveling of who you thought you were, after the countless nights where prayer felt like whispering into emptiness, something begins to rise. It doesn't come with noise or announcement. It doesn't break open the sky. It begins softly, like the first breath after holding it too long. It's the resurrection of the quiet soul. This is not a return to the person you once were. It's the awakening of someone you never knew existed. The silence has done its work. It has stripped away the excess, the illusions, the need for control, and in its place, a new depth of peace begins to form. You feel lighter, not because life has become easier, but because you've stopped carrying what was never yours to bear. The noise that once defined your worth no longer commands you. You move slower, but you see more. You speak less, but you understand more. The quiet within you has become alive. At this stage, you realize that God's silence was not an absence, but a womb. Everything that felt like death was gestation. Every unanswered prayer, every night of confusion, every tear that fell into the dark was the soil where transformation took root. The quiet was not a void, it was incubation. You were being formed, shaped, and sanctified in stillness, so that when you emerged, you would no longer live from reaction, but from revelation. The noise that once drove you no longer has power because you've learned to hear something deeper. The voice beneath all voices, the still pulse of divine presence moving through your every breath. What once felt like loss now feels like alignment. You begin to understand that God never stopped working. He was simply working in ways too delicate to be seen. From a neurological perspective, the brain, after deep rest, reorganizes itself. It integrates fragmented experiences, healing memories and rebuilding coherence. Spiritually, this mirrors what's happening inside you now. The fragments of your faith, the shattered pieces of understanding, begin to align. Your perception stabilizes. Your nervous system, once hijacked by uncertainty, learns the rhythm of trust. The inner chaos that once consumed you has been replaced by order, not external order, but an internal harmony that holds steady regardless of circumstance. You have been rewired by silence. The old patterns of fear no longer dominate because your faith has matured beyond the need for constant reassurance. You are no longer chasing God, you are walking with him. The resurrection of the quiet soul is not dramatic. It's subtle, sacred, steady. You notice it in how you respond differently to pain. You notice it in how your heart no longer demands immediate resolution. You notice it in how you've stopped bargaining with God and started abiding in him. This new peace isn't fragile, it's foundational. It's built from surrender, constructed in the hidden architecture of trust. The same silence that once frightened you now feels like home. You've learned that God's greatest language isn't always words, it's presence. It's the unspoken assurance that even when he withdraws his voice, his hands never leave your life. In this awareness, you begin to live with a new kind of confidence, quiet, steady, unshakable. The storms don't stop, but they no longer define you. The unanswered prayers no longer haunt you, because you now see that silence was never punishment. It was preparation. You've become what the silence was shaping all along, someone who doesn't just believe in God, but embodies his peace. The resurrection of the quiet soul is the moment you realize that the void you feared was actually the birthplace of purpose. That the emptiness you resented was the space where divine fullness was taking form. You don't need to understand how it happened. You only need to live in the awareness that it did. By the end of this journey, you understand what the silence was for. It wasn't to break you, it was to build you. It wasn't to remove God's presence, but to reveal it inside you. You no longer strain to hear His voice, because your whole being has become a living echo of it. The quiet that once terrified you now lives within you as strength. The same stillness that once made you question His love now becomes proof of it. Because when God goes silent, He isn't leaving, He's creating. And when that work is complete, what rises from the silence isn't just a healed person, it's a resurrected soul, one that knows peace not as a fleeting feeling, but as a permanent home.